All right, here we are at the next unit, which includes tissues. And then chapter 5 is all about the integumentary system, or the skin. So this chapter is going to go through the 4 main tissues of human beings and the types of cells and the types of tissues within them that you would see, and some of their functions and all that good stuff. So I'm going to start my timer. Have your book in front of you. Have your phone put away. Have some paper and some pens, because we're going to be doing a graphic organizer as notes. Okay, so I am starting here on page 143. And these, this first couple of modules here just kind of go through the basics of where you're at in your organization, that hierarchy. So we are going to be at the tissues, cells and tissues section of that hierarchy. And so we're not going to really concern ourselves about the atoms and molecules anymore, because we want to know what's happening at the cellular and tissue level. So there are trillions of cells in the body, and they are constantly dividing, some faster than others. And so there's only 200 different types, about 200 different types of cells that work together to form tissues. And when you start studying the cells and the tissues that they make up, that's called histology. There are 4 basic types of tissues that we study in histology. They are epithelial, connective, muscle, and neural or nervous tissue. This picture is also on page 143, and it overviews sort of the hierarchy along with the 4 different tissue types. So we're going to go into these. This is a nice, real basic overview of all 4. Epithelial tissues are going to cover most surfaces and passageways. They also form some glands. Connective tissue fills internal spaces, providing structural support and energy. Nervous tissue is specialized to produce, oh my goodness, here is a nice typo on this picture. So anyway, sorry about that. This should be muscle tissue. It contracts to produce movement. It is correct in your textbook though. So this should be muscle tissue, which contracts to produce movement. And then here's nervous tissue, which specialized to conduct electrical impulses. Okay, a quick review of the types of microscopes and the types of micrograph that you might see in this chapter. Microscopy is the study and use of microscopes. And we have simple microscopes and compound microscopes and electron microscopes. Simple microscopes use 1 lens. You could use a hand lens and call it a microscope. A compound microscope are the ones we're using in lab. Those are the ones with a series of lenses and mirrors. There is an electron microscope as well, which is the best resolution and able to get very, very close. And let's look at some of those electron microscopes, because you might see some of these little abbreviations as you go up throughout this chapter. So this shows you some of the relative sizes. The human heart, 100 millimeters versus a red blood cell, which is 10 micrometers. And then you get down to very small atoms and molecules here, which are in the nanometers. So if you're looking at something that is kind of in the organelle level or below, you really need a scanning electron microscope. In the compound scope, we can usually see a nucleus and a cell membrane, but past that, we really don't have many organelles. With the plant cells, you can, but this isn't that. Okay, compound light microscope. 2 lenses magnify the specimen. We really did this in lab with the objective lens located on the revolving nose piece. You can see here the labeling, light microscope, and at 400 total magnification. Here's light microscope at 400. The total magnification is an objective times ocular. That's basically how many times its original size you're looking at it. Resolution is the ability to distinguish between two separate points, so it has to do with clarity. Okay, the types of electron microscopes. Now these microscopes take up rooms, so they're not something that you can carry around. A transmission electron microscope takes electrons and transmits them through the specimen. They use magnets to beam these electrons to the surface, and you need a very thin slice of that object. And here in the corner you can see it's a transmission electron microscope at 3000 total magnification. A scanning electron microscope is pretty neat because it takes electrons, but it doesn't go through the specimen, it kind of coats the specimen. So you get a really good details of the surfaces of the surface features of an object. So here you can see the much different picture. You can see the surface features of the respiratory tract. And here you see SEM, scanning electron microscope, times 15,000 total magnification. And that just goes through those notations. So the best way for you to learn about these 4 tissues is going to be to watch this video, read the section, and to create a graphic organizer. And there are tons of graphic organizers in the book. If you look on page 146, there's one of epithelial tissue right there. That might be one that you sort of work with, all right? These are graphic organizers. You know, you might start with the 4 types of tissues, and then you'll put epithelial, nervous, muscle, and connective in these bubbles, okay? It'll get kind of big if you extend it there, so maybe you make a second graphic organizer all about epithelial tissue, and you have the different types of cells and things. So the best way for you to do this is to create some kind of visual to see how these cells and tissues are related. Having said that, we're going to start with epithelium. And what I want to do for this video, it's going to be a little bit shorter, is give you a 5-minute or so review of the tissue, and then have you pause it, fill out your graphic organizer, and then move on to the next tissue. So starting with epithelial here, this is going to be your surface or passageway tissue. So anything that touches the air, your respiratory passages, your digestive, some of your digestive passages will definitely have several layers of epithelial. Any other surface of your organs are definitely going to have layers of epithelial. There's also glandular tissue, which is a type of epithelial tissue. This is, these are cells that are specialized to secrete something. Okay, so they're secretory cells. They secrete via exocytosis. And if you look, there's 2 types, exocrine and endocrine. And the exocrine are the ones that secrete it into surfaces or ducts, okay? Your sweat glands, for example, those are exocrine glands. They secrete the sweat into a duct. And then there's endocrine glands, which secrete hormones into interstitial fluid. So for example, your thymus and thyroid are going to secrete hormones directly inside your body, no ducts. Right, so here's epithelial, and here's the glandular tissue, and then here's 2 ways to think about the glandular tissue. So this could be a good starting point for your epithelial tissue. As we go over here, you're going to see there's way more branches though. Primary functions of the epithelial tissue, they provide physical protection, they control permeability. For example, selectively absorbing or secreting or acting as a barrier. They also have some nerve endings, for example, touch receptors. So a lot of the, if you remember the homeostatic controls, the effectors, the receptor side, have these like touch receptors, taste receptors, those are in the epithelial tissue. A lot of them produce specialized secretions like your sweat or sebum, which is oil, which is at the end of every hair follicle. Okay, your basic surface of the different types of epithelial tissue, you have an apical surface, apical like the apex or top. That's going to be the part that faces the external body or the internal space. So that's kind of like the outside. And then you have a basal layer, a base. which attaches to the underlying tissue. So a lot of these epithelial are connected to connective tissue or maybe to muscle. The basolateral surface is the base and the sides here. So you can see the base and the sides. Oops, sorry, got out of control here. Polarity, low, refers to the difference between the two sides. So sometimes there are structural differences. For example, here's some microvilli or cilia versus the basal. A lot of these apical surfaces have specializations, and so it's worth having a slide to themselves. If it's lining a tube, like say it's lining the inside of your intestines, the inside is called a lumen. It's an open cavity. Lumen generally means open cavity. There's also these specialized microvilli, which are found on the surface, and then there are cilia. There are also membranous organelles, a lot more membranous organelles compared to other cells. All right, so a general shape and layering, way to discuss the layering. Squamous cells are flat and thin. When we did our cheek cell, those were squamous cells. And I said they kind of look like baked lays, the shape of baked lays. So squamous cells, if you were to look at it head on, which is the way we looked at it, they would look like geometrical baked lays, but they're very thin and very flat. Cuboidal look like little boxes. And columnar, the way to differentiate between cuboidal and columnar is if it's taller than it is wide. If it's about as tall as it is wide, it would be a cuboidal. If it is one layer, it is simple. And if you look on page 147, these pictures become clear. If it is several layers, it's known as stratified. So we could describe this tissue as stratified squamous epithelium. We could describe this as stratified columnar epithelium. There are some attachments, and I lied. I might be a little bit over 5 minutes for epithelium because it's a huge group. These attachments are specialized. They function as a barrier. Okay, they can have. They may be able to replace damaged or lost cells. But they don't have blood vessels. They're avascular. So they are required to, like, that basal layer has to connect to some other tissue, connective tissue. Okay, some of those attachments, some of those intracellular connections. Hemidesmosomes. Those attach to the basement membrane, that basal layer, okay? Basal lamina contain these proteins and fine protein filaments. So here you can see this hemidesmosome right here. Here you can see some of the filaments that are attaching to the basement membrane. There's also something called a reticular lamina, okay? And that gives the bundles, this is like more coarser fibers. And if you look at this, you know, you see all these fibers here, and then you see them here. Those two layers together make up the basement membrane. We also have tight junctions, which you could have talked about in your cell lecture in biology. But these are basically just what they kind of sound like. They're tight, they're locking together, but they lock together so that water and solutes cannot pass between cells. So they're very interlocking. Adhesion belts. This strengthens that top apical region, and it could reinforce some tight junctions if you wanted that really airtight, watertight, whatever tight seal. Gap junctions, they kind of have that gap. So there is this opening or channel, connexons, okay? Those are transmembrane proteins that help with communication or circulation between two cells. Desmosomes. These are also helping with that firm attachment and interlocking of the cytoskeletons of adjacent cells. This is very strong. It resists stretching and twisting, and it's found in the superficial layer of skin. So superficial means the outside layer. So this is how your skin's cells are holding together. So here is where they're going to start talking about the types of specific epithelium. And if you look on page 150, what I would like you to focus on is the shape and layering. So squamous epithelium, simple squamous, stratified squamous. The specialized types of cells like keratinized and non-keratinized epithelial cells. They have, the keratinized having basically almost dead cells, but they're very strong because they have an extra part of keratin. So you're going to go through page 150. See, page 152 goes through some transitional epithelial and cuboidal, and page 154 is columnar. And so take a pause and go up to page 155, talking about all these different kinds, shapes, layering of of epithelium, squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. And then come back, and when we come back, I will be at the glandular epithelium. At this point, you can also fill in your flow chart or your graphic organizer. Okay, so again, glandular epithelial tissue produce secretions. The only reason I wanted to kind of bring this back is because when we talk about exocrine glands in integument and endocrine glands later on in nervous, you have to understand the difference is exocrine releases that into the ducts and out to the outside world. Endocrine releases it inside. So our endocrine organs are ones that are these type of glands. The types of secretions, merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. So merocrine is going to be produced from the vesicles during exocytosis, and it's kind of like salivary gland secretion. Again, it secretes it into a duct, so it's exocrine, and it mixes with water and forms mucus. And that's mucin, by the way, kind of like Mucinex. Apocrine, this is got part of the apical cytoplasm, so part of that top cytoplasm of the epithelial cell has secretory vessels, and those secretory vessels release the product as well as some of the cytoplasm. So for example, mammary gland secretion. It's a combination of types of secretions. And holocrine is one that actually destroys the cell that is secreting it. So the entire cell bursts, secreting whatever it is that is. And an example of that is sebaceous glands. There's multicellular and there's simple compound multicellular exocrine glands. Really the best way to describe this is when we get to it, and we're going to do that in the integumentary. But just to kind of preview that, the simple exocrine glands are a single duct, and there's not like this branching, whereas compound has these branching. And then the tubular kind of, it forms a tube, the glands. I mean, that's kind of the easiest way to put it. Alveolar kind of have this sac, and tubular ovular have the sacs at the end of the tubes. So it's kind of a combination. Oops. Some are unicellular, meaning a single cell is responsible for the secretion. Goblet cells are an example of that. Goblet cells are found along your digestive tract, for example, and they secrete that mucin. Okay, so along with filling in the rest of your graphic organizer for this section, for the epithelial, you're going to want to observe some of these tissues in the virtual slide box. We will be looking at it in lab, whether you are virtual or in person, but here is a preview of some of those. All right, we're going to jump into the next tissue, and again, I'm going to go over kind of the generalities, and then you're going to fill in your graphic organizer, kind of studying each of the pieces or each of the types of the connective tissue. Now, all of these connective tissues, they vary widely. And so in this particular one, you're going to have a lot of new names, and you're going to have, you know, location, what does it look like, and function for those. So your flow chart's getting bigger, or you might just want a single connective tissue graphic organizer. So connective tissue, it can be have a very structural function. It can transport fluids and materials. It can protect organs. It can interconnect to other types of tissues, store energy, or defend from microorganisms. They also have some connective tissues that could have some of these sensory receptors that detect different senses, different stimuli, I should say. The three basic components, but these are varied depending on the type of tissue where it's found. They have specialized cells, and they have special names for each of those cells. They have an extracellular protein fiber, and those also have special names. And then they have some kind of ground substance, which is some kind of fluid or filler. This is also part of the matrix. And the matrix is all these fibers that surround the cell, and it's most of the volume of the connective tissue. So kind of what makes up the bulk, but it's not the specialized cell. All right, so if you look on page 159, you will see the types of connective tissue, the three types. We have connective tissue proper, which I'll refer to just as proper. And this is got lots of different kinds of cell types and extracellular fibers, but there's two main types: loose, which include areolar, adipose, and reticular, or dense, which is dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. And it has to do with how the fibers look when you look at it. So they're either a loose open framework or they're densely packed. You then have fluid connective tissues, which are blood and lymph mostly, and these have a very watery matrix with very specialized cells, very distinctive cells within them. Then you have supportive connecting tissue, and these are things like cartilage and bone. Cartilage, there's three types: elastic, hyaline, and fibrocartilage. And then bone is very unique. You will, when you see a picture or a micrograph of a bone, you will know it. All right, so I'm just gonna quickly, and I know I'm doing it more than 5 minutes, so I'm just gonna quickly point you to the right pages and let you go here. Page 160 starts the loose connective tissue, so it will go through the reticular, collagen, and elastic fibers. Then page 162 goes through the dense connective tissues, and 163 is the fluid connective tissues. Cartilage starts on page 164, bone on page 166, okay? I will meet you back at page 168 here, so start filling in that graphic organizer and working on connective tissue. Okay, also make sure you're looking at some of these virtual slide boxes. This is a direct link to the connective tissue, and then this bottom one here is to the cartilage and bone. Again, those are slides that we'll look at in lab, or you might be looking at it again if you're a virtual. Okay, so the next section is about membranes. So membranes are made up of epithelium and connective tissue. So we're going to kind of pause here and talk about membranes. They line or cover surfaces, typically epithelium and connective. So there's 4 types in the body: mucous, serous, cutaneous, and synovial. And they're all found all over with their specific functions. Mucus. Mucous membranes, they are what they sound like. They line the passageways, and they can secrete, some of them can secrete, some of the cells rather, can secrete some kind of specialized liquid to help keep the organ or area moist, to allow for movement, to lubricate so that there's no friction. And this is supported by a special kind of areolar connective tissue called lamina propria. And you can see that in the picture right here. That's the connective tissue. And these are the, if you've seen these in some of the other pictures, these are the vessels that are through the connective tissue. So connective tissue is vascular. Serous membranes. We talked about this when we looked at the cavities in lab. These have a watery serous fluid that kind of coats the surface. There are divisions that kind of go along the cavity lines. So like pleura, those are the serous membranes along the lungs, pericardium along the heart, and peritoneum, that's the kind of abdominal cavity and visceral organs. Cutaneous membranes cover the whole surface of the body. So when you're talking about your skin, cutaneous membranes. Composed of stratified squamous epithelium, areolar connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue. It's thick, it's waterproof, it's dry. And synovial membranes. When you see the word synovial, think joints. These are going to line the joints, all the joint cavities. It's going to have a fluid that lubricates the joint, okay, and it's called synovial fluid. It's going to provide oxygen and nutrients to the cartilage that's in that area as well. There is no basement membrane, so it's technically not an epithelium. So this is, any joint that we talk about is lined with synovial membranes, and that's good because it helps the joint last. Okay, there's also fascia. Fascia are types of tissue that help to surround and support the organs. So there is superficial, deep, and subserous, and they talk about that on page 169. Superficial fascia is under the skin, and it's composed of areolar and adipose tissue. Deep fascia is deeper, obviously, but it's got a lot of other connective tissue structures, including vascularization, and it's very strong and a fibrous internal network. And then subserous fascia is between any serous membrane of an organ plus the deep it's between the serous membrane of the organ and the deep fascia of the layer above. And this is entirely areolar. And there's the picture on page 169 where you see these different membranes here. Here you can see, let's see if I can arrow on there. There you go, superficial fascia. Then you've got deeper, wait a minute. You better look at your picture in your book because this is mislabeled again. Superficial fascia right here. Then you go deeper and get the deeper layers. And then the subserous is going to be right, so this purple here is the serous membrane. It's going to be right inside of that. So look at the picture in your book. There is a neat picture on page 171 that shows you this, which is the percentages of weight of all the tissue. I mean, your muscle tissue is 50% of your weight, and then your connective tissue is the 45% because that's your bones and your blood and a lot of the other mass of you or volume of you. And then nervous and epithelial are very, very small. So at this point, you're going to pause. You're going to make sure that all of your connective tissue is filled out. And we're going to move into muscle and nervous, which is a much smaller group. And I know I am well over my 20 minutes, but I promise it won't be much more. Muscle tissue. So we want another kind of bubble in our graphic organizer, another list. There's 3 types of muscle tissue. I promise there's only 3. Skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And they're named for their function. So skeletal, it's against the skeleton, so it moves the body. Cardiac is the heart muscle, and it's only found in the heart. Smooth muscle is involuntary, and it helps smooth things along the digestive tract and along arteries and veins. This just kind of restates that information. I am on page 172. What you're going to do now is you're going to take a pause and you're going to look at the 3 types of muscles, and you're going to fill in your graphic organizer of those 3 types, and I will meet you back at nervous. Nervous tissue, again, I promise you it's very short. Neurons or neuroglia are the 2 types of cells. Neurons are the ones that are specialized to actually conduct a message, okay? Neuroglia or glial cells are supporting, they are somehow supporting those types of neurons. Now there aren't, even though there's, you know, two basic cells, the neurons themselves can look very different as well as the neuroglia. They are the longest cells in the body, so those are pretty interesting. They can be up to 1 meter. There are very long neurons connecting your brain and spinal cord to other parts of your body. The basic structure of a neuron, the dendrites, that means, think of tree. Dendrology is actually the study of trees. I took a class in college in dendrology. And so it's the part that's actually branching from the main cell body. So cell body is what you would look at to see any of the most of the organelles. So your nucleus will be there and many of the other organelles. The axon is the long kind of tail that helps to conduct the information to other cells. And so here you have your dendrites, your cell body, and your axon. Neuroglia, there's different structural types, but basic function is to support. They can repair, they can undergo phagocytosis, which is the idea that they eat things around it. They provide nutrients, they regulate the interstitial fluid. All right, that's the end of the nervous system, so you can go ahead and fill in your graphic organizer. This video is about 10 or 11 minutes long, just overviews all 4 of those sections. There's going to be a lot of new words in this chapter, so you'll really need to focus in on that. I'm not going to go over the last section on the clinical module on response to tissue injury. I do want you to take a look at that. That's something that I want to talk about in our Friday discussion, along with any questions that you have. Maybe there's a section that you're like, I read it, I put it in my graphic organizer, I don't get it. Bring that to our Friday discussion. I'd love to talk about it then.